on Facebook right now, and we're recording. So, hello, David. How are you?
Hi, how are you?
I'm
I'm
doing
good.
good. Gonna just fill a little bit of airtime while Facebook's letting everybody know that we're here and that we're live and ready to talk about a great book called 1962. So in the meantime, I'm going to fill just a little bit of air with that. David, where are you calling in from today?
Jersey City, New Jersey.
Jersey City, New Jersey. All right. So Warwick's my little sign there. We are actually located in La Jolla. It's a little bit north of San Diego proper. And so we've got both coasts covered this afternoon, here, evening where you're at. Hopefully we'll get some people in the middle joining us too. 'Tis the season to start getting into thinking about baseball. I think opening day is starting, I think, next week for everybody, right?
This week.
Is it this week?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I don't know why I was thinking it was. Well, maybe our home opener isn't till next week. I think our guys
Right.
maybe our guys in the Padres may be starting somewhere else, but aren't going to be here until next week. So that may be where my brain was at with that. Couple quick things before we get started. We are live on Facebook now. If you're watching this later on YouTube, we're not live with you, but it's going to be a great discussion that David's going to have about his book. So stick there. And it'll be it gets some really interesting tidbits on that. If you are live with us though on Facebook, on the comment section there, I'm going to put how to order David's book from us at Warwick's. If you're in the San Diego area, you can come by. We love seeing people at the store. You can come by and do that. But if you're not, go ahead and click on that and we can ship that to you. Also in that comment section is where you're going to put in any questions that you have. We love audience questions. So David's going to talk for about 20 minutes about his book. So start thinking about some good questions. Don't be shy. We love audience questions. So make sure you pop those in there too. So I'm going to do a quick intro of you, David, and then I'll go off screen for a little while and let you talk about your book. So David Krell is the author of 1962, Baseball and America in the Time of JFK, which he's here to talk today about. He also wrote Our Bums, the Brooklyn Dodgers in History, Memory and Popular Culture, and Do You Believe in Magic? Baseball and America in the groundbreaking year of 1966. David often lectures at Society for American Baseball Research conferences, the annual Cooperstown Symposium on Baseball and American Culture, and the annual Mid-Atlantic Nostalgia Convention. So David, welcome. Can't wait to hear about 1962. So take it away and have a great, we'll see you in a little bit. Let me know when you're ready to take some questions.
You bet. Thank you, Julie. And thank you, Amanda, for helping set this up. I'd like to talk about three things involving 1962, the book. One is 1962, the year, why it was so pivotal. The second is the baseball component. And the third is the research, because I often get asked how I went about the research. Well, 1962 was an extraordinarily important year. I couldn't believe that it hadn't been documented in this kind of a format before. You had John Glenn going in orbit, first American astronaut in orbit. That was incredibly important to catch up to the Russians in the space race. Grissom had gone up and Alan Shepard had gone up, but they were suborbital. This was the first astronaut to go around the Earth. And if you had seen the movie The Right Stuff or read the book, you'll know that he had to come back early. They cut the trip short because they thought there might be a problem with the heat shield. Some other things that happened in 1962, the twist. That was a huge dance craze. You'll all remember the twist by Chubby Checker. It was referenced in a Dick Van Dyke Show episode from February of 62, except they called it The Twizzle. There was a comic book about the twist. It was in a show called Saints and Sinners, an episode of a short-lived show. It was in an episode of Route 66 that went on for 4 years, all in 62. One of the other things that happened in 62, white supremacy. This was not a recent invention. 1962 is thought of as Leave It to Beaver and very saccharine, benign popular culture programs. Not the case. Route 66 had the two guys traveling in a Corvette across the country. They go to Boston and they meet a guy who claims to be a patriot. It turns out he's a white supremacist. And the FBI recruits the two fellas, Buzz and Todd, to take him down, which they do. Pretty heady stuff for 1962. It wasn't all Leave It to Beaver. And one of the things that that really struck me was the dramas. Sam Benedict was a TV show about lawyers. Perry Mason, certainly. You had the topics in Route 66 were hard hitting. I had never been exposed to them because I grew up on sitcoms and reruns from the 60s when I grew up in the 70s and 80s. So the 1 hour dramas were pretty much a revelation to me. Some of the other things that happened, you see John F. Kennedy throwing out the first pitch at the All-Star game. That 62 was also the year when he proclaimed that we're going to the moon. We will go to the moon and return a man safely to Earth. That was a turning point in the space race. You had some other things that year. We're talking to book lovers. So you might remember that Sex and the Single Girl was a pretty powerful bestseller. That was 1962. Failsafe, 7 Days in May, two political thrillers were in 1962. You had movies like How the West Was Won, Advise and Consent. If you think that what's going on in Washington now is bizarre and heart-wrenching, read the book Advise and Consent and watch the 1962 movie with Walter Pidgeon and Peter Lawford. Certainly, it was a great year for movies. Lawrence of Arabia, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, Lolita. We're talking about provocative, really cutting-edge, hard-edged movies from Hollywood that would not have been seen in 1957 or 1955 or 1952, and so on. So let's talk a little bit about baseball. This book was originally conceived as a baseball book. I was in a writing workshop and I wanted to write a book about the 1962 baseball season, Mets and the Colt 45s. Well, no one had really talked about the Colt 45s. The Mets have been talked about somewhat, but I wanted to go a little deeper. I wanted to chronicle all 25 players. And I came to the workshop really excited about this project. Julie had mentioned my book, Our Bombs, about the Brooklyn Dodgers. Well, that was born in this same workshop. So when I returned and re-enrolled, this was the idea: 1962 baseball, 90%, everything else will be in the background. Well, the instructor said, David, I know that you're a baseball guy, but books with broader topics get broader readerships. So why don't you think about that? And I went home that night and I knew there were some things that happened in 62. I knew the Flintstones and the Dick Van Dyke Show were in the early part of the 60s. So I wrote those down. But there were other things. The Cuban Missile Crisis I knew was in 62. I did not know that it's the year where Kennedy proclaimed we're going to the moon. I knew it was John Glenn who went up. I didn't know about the other two astronauts too well. I didn't know there were 3 missions in 1962. After John Glenn, there were Scott Carpenter and Wally Schirra. So if I had known that, I forgot about it. So I wanted to get that in there. You take a lot of time when you come across things like this, and it just makes you want to go further. So I kept Googling and researching. So when I came back to the class, I had about 30 or 40 topics to cover, and I could group them together, and I had an outline. And when I said to the class, this should be 50% baseball and 50% everything else, everybody kind of looked at each other and said, yeah, that will work. That will work. You'll get a broader readership, more interest, and you'll probably have more fun doing it, which was actually the case. So for Houston, I happened to be in Houston at the SABR convention. And one day I went to the University of Houston library where they have papers about the forming of the Colt 45s, which was later renamed the Astros, and all about the demographics and the money, the marketing, the TV stations, the radio stations, the market reach, how many people in the audience do you think you can reach with your radio station, or the ownership breakdown, the initial newsletters for the company. These are things that you just can't find in too many places. So when I found that, it was like a treasure trove. New York, I relied mostly on newspapers at the New York Public Library. Some I could get on ProQuest and newspapers.com, which are databases. Some are not digitized, so I had to go and use microfilm. I talked to some players. I did a lot of research on the baseball websites, and the Baseball Hall of Fame was invaluable in providing information about these players. And that was a real challenge. What am I going to do with the Mets and the Colt 45s? How do you block this out? And surely they weren't the only things that happened in baseball. It was a 7-game World Series that year. You had Willie McCovey making the last out to Bobby Richardson. You had 5 no-hitters. Bo Belinsky, a controversial figure, was one pitcher who threw a no-hitter. He was 28-51 lifetime, but people still remember him for his off-the-field exploits. He dated actresses. He was engaged to Mamie Van Doren. He loved to party. But I got a chance to talk to people who knew Bo in the later part of his life, the last 10, 12 years of his life in Las Vegas when he worked for a car dealership. And people told me, we don't recognize the Bo that you're talking about from the 60s. The Bo that we recognize was much gentler, courtlier, in recovery from alcoholism. And it was really interesting for me to contrast that. You have other things that are going on in 62 besides the Mets and the Colt 45s. It's the second year for the AL expansion teams. So I wanted to make sure I chronicled that. You have the Senators, second incarnation of the Senators. The first incarnation goes to Minnesota and becomes the Twins in 61. And of course, the California Angels debuted in 1961 as well. There were so many things that were going on in this year. The embarrassment was more of, how do I stop? And there was a point where I just had to put the brakes on myself, because there was just so much coming at me. And every time I thought I was done, someone would mention a movie from 1962, or I'd find an episode from a drama in 1962, or a book, or something interesting that happened in baseball. And I'd say, well, I have to include that. I have to include that. So I got extensions from my publisher. And what happened is I wound up with 365 double-spaced pages. And when I finally handed it in, the response I got back was, great job. Now you have to cut it down by 20% because you only have a certain amount of words that you're allowed to use for this book. Obviously, you could go on and on. You could write a 700-page book about 62. It was the year the Beach Boys debuted. It was the year the Beatles debuted their albums. Johnny Carson took over the Tonight Show in 62. Obviously, we didn't know in 1962 that he would become the king of late night, but you have to start somewhere. And he was a comedian. He was a game show host. He took over for Jack Parr. Some of you may know that. Jack Parr was a pretty decent draw for 5 years as host of the Tonight Show. So there was just a lot coming at me. And the only way that I could figure out how to break this up was to do it, to do a chapter for a topic. So I would have a chapter about the Mets, a chapter about the Colt 45s, a chapter only about movies, a chapter only about literature. And of course, you know, if there are any film scholars out there, you might say 1939 is the best year for movies. I would argue 1962 is, but I couldn't write about every single movie. I had to leave some out. I had to leave out Lawrence of Arabia if I wanted to get in Advise and Consent. So it's not meant to be an absolutely comprehensive look. It's supposed to give you a slice of life. This is what life was like in 1962, especially for baseball fans. So the third thing I want to talk about is research, and I'll be succinct about this. The research is so key to something like this. The organization, the grunt work, the boring grunt work, you have to front load it. It is absolutely imperative because you do not want to leave it to the middle. When I'm talking about grunt work, I'm talking about labeling the PDFs that you're downloading. If you're downloading an entire page from the New York Daily News or the New York Post or the LA Times, you know, label it by year and date and the name of the paper. And if you have more than one article or one page from that date, then label it number 1, number 2. It is so boring and so necessary. And the reason is when you are working at midnight and you have that, you know, that spark of inspiration, and you just are writing and writing, and then you say, oh, I need to write about this topic. Let me go find the articles to support the thesis. Let me find articles to get the quotes. You do not want to be hunting around with these long names for the files that the computer will give you. You want to have everything set so you can find the article in 5 seconds in your system, whatever your system is going to be. I used a lot of microfilm. I watched movies, obviously, TV shows, Saints and Sinners I had never heard of before. And I found it very interesting. Route 66 I had heard of, but I bought the DVDs and watched a few episodes to get the flavor. I was incredibly impressed with the production values because they literally went across the country and they filmed in different cities. So it wasn't Vancouver substituting for Boston or LA substituting for Boston. It was Boston. And if they were in Chicago, it was Chicago. Cleveland, it was Cleveland. It was incredibly real, or at least realistic to me, to have to see these locations. Keeping track of everything was difficult. It was it can be a grind, but you just have to do a little bit each day. I'm not one who says I'm going to block out Sunday and I'm just going to work for 9 hours, because sure as the sun comes up, something will happen Saturday night and you won't be able to do it. So a little bit each day is better than leaving it all for a weekend day. So with that, I will welcome any questions that Julie and Amanda can filter. I'm at your disposal.
Excellent. Oh, so fascinating. I mean, okay, I love the little of the tidbits you were talking about, like that the twist was called the twizzle.
Oh yeah.
That was
in a bowling alley, and it took place in a bowling alley.
But bowling alleys were so big back then.
Right.
Were so big. I mean, I remember my grandparents, and that was a big
the
place
The Dick Van Dyke Show was expert. Carl Reiner was an expert at incorporating 60s hallmarks. The show is timeless because there aren't a lot of them, but you can't help but see them throughout. When Rob is having the nightmare about Planet Twilo, and Mary Tyler Moore comes down the pile of walnuts in the closet. Well, that's the Twilight Zone, of course. And when an FBI agent named Bond wants to use the Petrie's house to stake out a neighbor, Bond being a reference to James Bond. So it was really interesting to see those things.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that you talked about. And I think every author has this in common, is that there is so much information and you can't put it all in. I mean, the book could be 10,000 pages with all the information.
The research and the outlining and the prep is even more important than the writing. And this is something I've learned going through each book and really becoming more attentive to the outlining process and the research, because it'll give you a roadmap. It'll definitely give you a roadmap, and it'll make things easier. It's a lot easier to write 2 pages a day with a good outline than to just start brainstorming and think you're going to write 8 pages that day. It's not productive. Maybe you could do it. I found the other way to be much more productive.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that everybody's got their style, but it's just like when you're dealing with that much information, you have to have that. Okay. So the question comes in. So how do you argue with a movie aficionado that 62, not 39, is the best year for movies?
Advise and Consent, Lawrence of Arabia, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, Lolita. The list goes on and on and on. I mean, this was just incredible. Cape Fear. The first Cape Fear.
Yeah.
There's
no.
movie. The Three Stooges Go to the Moon, I think, is the name of the movie. So you had the real bizarre stuff too, but you just had things that were I don't know how to say it other than diversity. Bachelor Flat was one of these romantic comedies, but they had some camera shots in there that I mentioned that you wouldn't have had in 1957. So I would just go down the list And just because you have Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Gone with the Wind, and The Wizard of Oz, that's all great, but look at 62, just compare them.
Yeah, no, and it is. I mean, and who knew that 62, there's another question coming, but who knew that 62 was this like, so when you look at all of history and stuff, that when you narrowed in to 62, and that's
Right.
what the question is, what made you decide to narrow in to 62? What was that defining
Well,
thing?
once I saw when I came home from the workshop that night and I Googled and I saw all of these topics, I said, wait a minute, I think I'm onto something, but no, somebody must have done this. This is too easy. Somebody must have done this before, but even if they had, it was limited to Kennedy or a movie or something like that, and they didn't have the baseball component. And then I looked for baseball books and nobody had talked about this year in total for baseball. Yes,
Right.
there are books about the 62 Mets, but let's face it, I have an advantage because I have access to newspapers that people didn't have even 20 years ago. You know, you have databases, newspapers.com is adding newspapers every day.
Oh, interesting.
So you have that, plus I'm very close to the New York Public Library, so they have every newspaper from New York City on microfilm. That's a big advantage. People always tell me that, what they're working on, or they ask me, what do you think of this topic? And if they say, well, I want to write about the Chicago Cubs, I say, great. Are you going to Chicago? Oh, no, I can't do that. Well, then don't do that.
Right.
Find something local, right? Find something local. And even if you can do that, Julie, let's say that money is not an issue, or you can use credit card points or hotel rewards points to pay for your trip. Are you going to spend 2 weeks in Chicago? Can you afford that time? Maybe
Right.
you can, but that's 2 weeks away from other stuff that you could be doing closer to home. So if it's someone in La Jolla, look into the Padres, not just the Padres of the major leagues, but the Padres of the Pacific Coast League have an
Right.
incredibly rich history.
Right. So, and you're right. That is the thing that it's, some people miscount, they want to do the big thing. They want to go,
Right.
it's like they want to do the big, and it's like, no, being good at something, which leads me to a question about you.
Yeah.
What got you interested? What tell me a little bit about you and your genesis into all of this.
Into this book specifically, or writing in general?
Just writing in general, but writing about baseball. I mean, what happened with wanting to do that?
This happens like so often from a downturn. I was laid off in 2008 and I was looking for something to do. Nobody was returning phone calls. And I saw this ad online for a nonfiction book proposal class. And I had no idea what that meant. I did not know what a book proposal was. Apparently, you need a 40 to 80 page document. If an agent is even interested in your idea, they want to see the proposal. And without going into it with too much detail, 2 to 3 page summary, annotated table of contents, 1 page bio, a marketing plan, just a list of marketing outlets that you think might be interested, like the Today Show or something like that. And of course, a 20 to 30 page chapter. So I took the class and I got a great response for my first idea, but ultimately nobody wanted to represent me. I wasn't totally discouraged because I said, if I can get 20 agents even interested past the query letter, then I might be onto something. And I had written this book about the Brooklyn Dodgers for the New York Bar Association. There was a bar in Brooklyn called the Brooklyn Dodger. The LA Dodgers sued, MLB sued, and they said trademark infringement. The judge said, well, you abandoned Brooklyn. You don't use the trademark Brooklyn Dodgers. So the bar wins. It was David versus Goliath. And I wrote an article about that. And when I went to the class, I said, okay, I have 100 pages double spaced. I was so full of myself. I said, oh, this is going to be, no, what do I need? Another 100, 120 pages? This is nothing. So I read the pages in class. We had to read 5 pages from our specific works. And everybody in the class, I think there were seven or 8 of us, everybody said, wow, you write really well. But it kind of sounds like it's for something academic. And I said, in my head, I'm saying, what are you talking? Oh, yeah, it's for a law journal. Oh, I have some work to do here. I see. This is a different type of writing. So I had to really work in the classes. And I took that class a few times just to air out some ideas. Without it, I couldn't have done it. It was at a place called Media Bistro. It was a continuing education place. And the guy who taught the class was a literary agent named Ryan Fisher Harbaj. And on our last class, he wrote on my paper, "You will sell this one." And it was 1962.
Awesome. That's fantastic. And so, which leads to another question that came in. What's the most valuable writing advice you've ever received?
Oh gosh. I think it's the advice you're going to hear in every single writing class ever. And it might be the number one tip that they tell you. Be prepared to throw your darlings overboard. Those beautiful paragraphs, those wonderful pages, those segues, those metaphors, that research that you spent 2 weeks on. Be prepared to take out the red pen and sacrifice them, because it's going to happen. It's going to happen for flow. It's going to happen because the publisher won't have the space, especially now with paper costs being the way they are. You have to get used to that. Now, I would say, if they're that good, keep them in a folder. Maybe you use them somewhere else. Maybe you'll use that description somewhere else, but be prepared. It's going to happen.
Yeah, we had a mystery writer one time that like killed off her main character like halfway through the book, and everybody was just like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
So yeah, you have to do that sometimes. So so what are you working on next? You mentioned a little bit. I don't know if we were in the green room or if it was something that you talked about at the beginning, but what you got coming next for us?
Right now, I'm finishing up a book for University of Nebraska Press, same people who published 1962. That book is a cultural history of the Boston Red Sox. And that book will show you the Red Sox in a way that you've never seen before. Some of the topics are Bill Buckner's redemption in Curb Your Enthusiasm, the TV show Cheers, and how the Red Sox theme was prevalent, especially in the first 2 seasons, but certainly sprinkled throughout afterwards in the remaining 9 seasons. Red Sox in movies like Fear Strikes Out and The Town, a little known movie called Game 6 with Michael Keaton. You have an artistic analysis of the statues in Fenway Park, or outside Fenway Park, I should say. An oral history of the fans. And the fans have been terrific in sharing their personal connections to the Red Sox.
Oh,
I
bet,
don't
yeah.
have a date for that, Julie, but I'm hoping it's next year.
Okay, excellent.
I'm
Well,
hoping
there
it'll be
are, I
published
mean,
next year.
everybody claims to be the biggest fans of their own
Yeah.
team, but there's something about Boston fans that are just
Oh
like,
my God. I asked people to fill out a questionnaire. I did not get pages. I mean, I did not get paragraphs. I got pages, several pages.
Yeah.
I told them I can't print everything. And this is another book. I only can fit you into a chapter. So, but people 3-4 pages about their favorite game, their favorite player, what the Red Sox mean to them. It's terrific. I'm also working on a book. I'm just starting about Bo Belinsky, because when I was doing the research for 62, the people who knew him in Las Vegas, where he spent the last 10, 12 years of his life, they said, we have stories. You have enough to write a bio, and nobody's written a bio of Bo Belinsky. He wrote an autobiography in the 70s, but it's nothing. It's a lot of surface stuff, and I don't think he would have written that same biography 20 years later.
Interesting. You got some good stuff on the. You've got to, pardon my phone ringing in the background. We're at the store here. You've got some good stuff coming though for us, David. Really interesting things. Hey, it's been great getting to talk to you about 1962. We appreciate you being here. Remember, you can order it through the link. If you're on YouTube, we'll put that link on YouTube as well, or go to your local independent bookstore if you're somewhere else in the country. Support David, support his writing, And we'll look forward to, maybe we'll see you next year, David, when the next one's out.
I hope so. And I will ask, if you do buy the book, after reading it, please consider writing a review on Amazon. They're incredibly important feedback for writers.
Excellent. All right, David. Well, thank you for your time, and we'll see you maybe in a year or so.
I hope so. Thank you. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.